Welcome to the Peaked podcast, where I talk about gender identity ideology and other bad ideas, women's rights, and free speech from a European point of view. Right, so Paddy O'Gorman, you'd be well known on the Irish scene, but my listeners of my podcast, I have a lot of Irish listeners, I have a lot of English, American listeners. I sort of like to let people know what's going on in Europe and the EU, which are not necessarily exactly the same things, but the
Sure.
continent generally. And you had a very interesting piece out recently that is a subject close to my heart, obviously relating to the gender thing, but in particular relating to trans medical tourism, basically. So for people who don't know who you are, you're a journalist. Formerly worked for RTE, which is the state
Yeah.
broadcaster.
Yeah. For 40
And
years, yeah.
then for 40 years. And so you're a household name at home. What's the deal now? You're writing about gender generally. You're writing a bit for
Well, I
Gript
do.
here and there.
I write for Gript occasionally. I write for Stella O'Malley's Gen Spec regularly. I write for Gript because it's a conservative website. But, well, the reason I started writing for Gript is I did a story as a podcaster, which nobody else was touching, but simply about women in domestic violence refuges being subjected to men wearing G-strings. And I don't know what French knickers are, but apparently they can still tell it's a G-string, still it's a man. And then what happened? A woman got beaten up. I was absolutely shocked as I heard this story. I was standing at the homeless persons unit in North Cumberland Street in Dublin, and that's a place that people go when they're just out of prison. And there was a woman there, came out, she had a plastic bag, so she'd clearly just been out of prison. And she told me she'd been in prison in Dublin. She told me she was hoping to deal with her drug problem, which most women who a lot of people who end up in prison, it's addiction problems, like. But I said to her, "Do you ever Limerick?" No, I said, "You know, because they have trans-identified men in Limerick prison." She says, "No," she says, "not only that, they have them in the domestic violence refuges." And I said, "They do what?" And I was absolutely gobsmacked. "Oh, yeah, a girl was beaten up." Now, it was a 60-year-old woman of slight stature, got beaten to the ground by this guy. And it was months later I realized the identity of him. He was one of the men who'd been in Limerick Women's Prison. This guy, he's a big Dublin fella from Tala, actually, and a big Viking. Unlike, say, Barbie Kardashian, who was one of the more notorious transgender prisoners, who was a very slight man by comparison. But this guy, when he came out of Limerick prison, where he wasn't a sex offender. He's the only one who's not a sex offender. It was beating people up, serious assaults. They put him into the domestic violence refuge in Rathmines in Dublin, which was known in its day as the Battered Wives Home. When I was a young person living in Rathmines, like many country people would have been living in that flatland of Dublin. And I was absolutely shocked by this story. And I got on to the city council. I says, "Is it true that you're putting your homeless persons units, you're putting them into trans-identified men?" And I still didn't know this was a guy with a serious record for violence with it, but
What's
and they
this
wrote
lad's
me
name
back,
again? This isn't this Sean Kavanagh guy.
Shauna
Shauna.
Kavanagh. Yeah, Sean. He goes by the name of
Kavanagh,
Shauna
right.
Kavanagh. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was in prison for beating up his uncle's partner, or his auntie's partner, I should say, and two other men, three men assaults, and he had other more minor things. But when he came out of Limerick Women's Prison, because he identified as a woman, they put him into a domestic violence refuge, the Battered Wives Home, as it used to be known in Rathmines in Dublin. And the inevitable happened, or at least nobody should be surprised. Within a couple of months, he'd beaten up a 60-year-old woman and he got evicted from the place. But I was hearing this story. I said, I can't believe this is, well, I know, believe that what these women aren't making this up. But 4 or 5 months later, he was in court for that assault. And that's when I realized who he was. He was a guy that actually, when he came out of prison with a proven record of violence, they put him into a domestic violence refuge. Now, I get to hear these things because of my own style of journalism, which is simply to stand at a place. I've been doing it for 40 years. I did it for RTE for many years in Tala. The first one I did, I remember one of the first I did was in Tala in what used to be called the Deserted Wives Queue. You're laughing, Roisin, yeah? Yeah,
I'm laughing because I'm thinking about a 4-year journalism degree of the Paddy O'Gorman Journalism School, and day one, stand at a place.
you stand at a place and listen. And that's how you find stuff. You don't know what you don't know. When you don't know what you don't know. And like coincidentally yesterday, I went back to that very same homeless persons unit. I'll put it out in the podcast in the next 24 hours. And I stood there And I was approached by people, well, because some of them know me and I have my dog with me, but just extraordinary stories. People out of prison. There's a lot of people there from Somalia, Nigeria, who tend to be well educated people. And not all of them, they choose not to speak to me. A Somalian guy very candidly talks about how he lost his passport on the way to Ireland and this is how you do it, you know? But these extraordinary stories from homeless people. There was a woman there explaining to me, "Oh, yeah, and I knew her 20 something years ago. I still make money with prostitution," she says, "because when you're begging and a man offers you to come home with him, you save a lot of money. It went a lot quicker." And so,
Yeah.
well, one of the things I do is choking. So what do you mean,
Right.
Teresa, choking? You or them? Oh, both. This woman is paying to get herself choked, you know? And she's a 48-year-old woman, like out in the street. Then there's another woman there, and she says to me, she lied to me the last time she met me. And funny, I sensed she wasn't telling me the full truth when I met her at the courts a few weeks ago. A person with, I believe, mental health issues, insofar as she's a mathematician, an academic. But she said, I was actually up for indecent exposure, was one of the things I was for. She says, when you're living rough, to go to the toilet, and she was complained, and it was behind Star Street Garda Station. It was one of the many things that she was charged with. But she didn't get prison, but she's out now. And I met her yesterday, and she talked to me about the roughness of being on the street. You know, she's not a Dublin woman, a rural background woman in her late 30s. I have to be careful with what I publish of it even, but the vulnerability
Yeah.
of people
I
who
know.
are there.
It's rough out
Because, you
there,
know,
isn't it?
it's
It's
rough out there.
extremely
But,
rough, and I think
but,
that one of your
mhm.
like, your things that you do is that you sort of show it's particularly elites maybe how really rough it is out there, you know, and I hope they're listening to you because when I first came across this gender issue, my brain first went to vulnerable women and
Yeah,
men and kids and
and men,
everyone and
yeah.
just the sort of things that they're up against. Sorry, I interrupted you there, but I just wanted to ask you maybe when you're finished telling this like, what draws you to this kind of work? Like, because I don't know what that draws particular people to it.
Yes, yes. As I say, well, that's how I was saying how I ended up with Gript is because Gript was the only
Oh,
part of the Irish
right.
media that picked up on this story of the woman who got beaten up. When he came to court, our media described it as a woman on woman attack. Now,
This is
you
about
know,
2023, is it?
2023. That's right, when he
Yeah.
came to court, and he got a 3-month suspended sentence. He was already back in prison for another assault, you know? But like the real story here is a man was put in a domestic violence refuge where a woman got beaten up. Instead of that, our journalists, the Irish Examiner, the Irish Independent, and I think the others simply ignored it, which is another way the media
Yeah.
deals with these things.
Yeah.
But they
Yeah.
pretended this was a simple woman on woman assault, which is a dog bites man story. But I was so shocked by this. And Gript Media, who have a sense of journalism about them as well, asked me about it and invited me to write on this. And that's how I started with Gript. They're considered a conservative website. To me, they're standing on those for those who are being punched down upon, literally, in this
Mhm.
case. Whereas
Mhm.
all our journalists stood with the man in the dress who was doing the punching down upon. Oh, his feelings have to be preserved at all costs. And that's how I was there. But you asked me, how did I get drawn to it? Roisin, I don't understand how anybody was never drawn to it. I mean, it's the journalist in me says, wow, you know,
But what
it's the
about all the
gee
rest of
whiz
them?
thing. Well, I can't work it out. I say when you see a fellow put into a women's TV refuge beating a woman up, you know, doesn't the journalist in you say, "My God, that's what we call a great story," which doesn't mean it's a good news story for somebody. It probably means the opposite. When we say a great story, it means that's a shocking story that people are going to want to hear about, and that's our job. And instead of that, our media has simply just gone on side, and I
How
really
do you
don't
explain
understand
it?
it.
You don't
I
understand it either.
actually
I don't
am
understand
puzzled
it.
by it. I'm shocked, saddened, and puzzled in equal measure about how our media has simply come on side with this thing. And it's a funny one. 30 years ago, I was in a lot of trouble over AIDS, and I saw you writing on that the other day. But I didn't see myself as having a particular role other than your obligation is to the public. And I used to believe all this stuff of it's not a gay thing, we're all equally at risk. And I was very close to it because I knew the Dublin injecting drug users very well at that stage because it was a story I've been covering for some years. So you had several thousand HIV positive people in Dublin, almost all of them young adults. At that time, it was very much concentrated in the city of Dublin, rather though the other drugs were everywhere in Ireland. And I could see after a couple of years, almost zero cases of transmission among heterosexuals was going on.
Even drug
That was
users.
even among drug users, from time and again when you had it, my Mary never took more than an aspirin. And then Mary would tell you, actually, I've been turning on for as long as, anybody else. But my mom, I like to tell my mom that I didn't. There was a kind of thing, whereas homosexuals were bad and drug users were bad, heterosexuals were innocent. Therefore, when people tested HIV positive, oh, it was her boyfriend who gave it to her, or, and this whole dynamic was there. But I could see very quickly that, contrary to what I believed, actually, yes, it is very much a gay thing. You may as well say that smokers are at no special risk of lung disease as say that gay men are not at risk of HIV infection. And it's just as a journalist, I was calling out
Yeah.
the medical
Well,
profession and
that's
calling out
an
the whole.
interesting it's an interesting
Mhm.
contrast with the trans issue because there was a very, very concerted effort in starting in 2000, 2001 to say, listen, stigma is the thing that's killing people. It's not the virus. And this was the position of the international public health bodies, particularly UNAIDS and the World Health Organization, who said it's not actually the virus that's killing people, it's stigma around the virus. And so what that meant was don't stigmatize anything. And what that meant was it became difficult to say, oh, this is a population associated with this disease because it was seen as stigmatizing. And I think that's done an awful lot of damage.
Yeah, I think you're
But
exactly right. Because that's what I was told. You're stigmatizing. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, but that's exactly what I was told, Roisin. You're stigmatizing. Sorry,
Mhm.
what is this? I am looking at this overwhelming. Of course, it was a special difficulty for homosexual men. Absolutely. Jane, you'd have to, you've no business in journalism or medicine or anything else. If you can't look at the overwhelming evidence at this stage that was there, which I was forced into simply by looking at it.
Do you think it's the same dynamic then?
It reminds me of it very much that, okay, I've retired from RTE 4 years now, 4 and a bit years. But the turns thing, I wasn't really conscious of it 5 years ago when I was still in RTE, but I was certainly banned from touching anything to do with HIV. Now, I'm old enough to have worked in Africa before, as a journalist, before they started calling everything AIDS. But I was absolutely not allowed to touch anything. And it's funny, like PrEP, which is pre exposure prophylaxis, which I was just looking at it the other day. Somebody sent me the health board, the health committee in the Dáil looking at it. Everybody's saying what a great success it's been. When you actually look at the HSE's own or the HBSC's annual reports, all it's got to say, after 6 years of giving gay men, and it is gay men who get it. You won't get it, Roisin. I won't get it. The vast majority of people who won't be getting this. It's to facilitate unprotected sex between gay men. That
Mhm.
is the
Yeah.
point of PrEP.
Yeah.
And what the HBSC, if you look at it last December, their most recent reports on it, all the best it could say is it is probable that some cases of HIV transmission have been prevented after 6 years of an annual budget of over 5.5 million a year. And you look at the joined up thinking on this, are they wondering why is there such an explosion of
Mhm.
STIs among homosexual
Mhm.
men?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, if
Absolutely.
you
That's the thing.
facilitate, if your public health policy, let God bring back the days when I was young and we used to say the safe sex message, which
Can I
was,
play the devil's advocate?
yes, of course, yeah.
So I understand why somebody working in an air conditioned office far away in Geneva would come up with this strategy. And it's because of human nature. They say it doesn't matter what nice safe sex messages we create. I'm not saying I agree with this, but men be fucking. Like that's just something that we're not going to change. So I think the thing with PrEP, why it was seen as such a miracle drug, is that as many people who know about this topic will tell you, it was a way for people to just carry on doing what they were doing. The only thing you have to do is make sure you take your medicine. And now the phase two of the rollout of PrEP is the one that you only have to get an injection of once every 6 months. That'd be perfect because getting people to take the drug is a nightmare. So it's all about sort of it's a harm reduction approach. So you can
I
see
can
why
see,
somebody might, in theory, say, look,
yeah,
you know what? We're not going to stop people doing what they do in bathhouses
yeah.
and in public parks and all this stuff. And I'm no judgment.
No, no, I
No,
absolutely, I
no,
think that was the reasoning. There was a pragmatic reasoning that it was a case of, well, hold on, this is harm reduction. But what about joined up thinking that if so
hmm
for everybody else, the safe sex message was still there, which was if you can't be good, be careful. Use a condom, use protection. For gay men, uniquely, away you go, lads.
off
And
you
this
go.
is what prep was about. And like
Yeah.
with joined up thinking, then why are we should not be surprised at this explosion of STIs among gay men now in
Mhm.
Ireland, and
And
not
also,
in
like,
particular, say, Cornia.
sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Also,
Yeah.
the sex positivity generally is all linked to that, and the comprehensive sexuality education came out of the UNAIDS
Yes, I was
thinking.
very interested in reading that. So I had to read that several times. You posted that just yesterday, I think, and I think, wow, that's so interesting. It hadn't occurred to me before.
All of the comprehensive sexuality education, all of it. I mean, there was a preventing teen pregnancies element of it that was very fashionable 20 years ago in the US, 30 years ago in the US. We've kind of seemed to have fixed that problem. But the whole thing was an initiative of the HIV/AIDS department
So I
in the
see, yeah.
WHO. Yeah, and then I mean, it's all harm reduction, and this is comprehensive sexuality education in a nutshell. Tell the kids are gonna be fumbling with each other anyway, so just make sure they're on the right drugs and make sure that they can say no if they want to, and
It's
that's
it's the whole
it's
spirit.
yeah.
Yes, that's the whole spirit of it. But when this was first proposed in 2019, our then Taoiseach Cleo Varadkar announced this wonderful new thing, PrEP, and I said, "Hello, what's this about?" And I wrote to Peace to RTE saying, "We need to cover this because," and I'll tell you, it was a well-known actor. And when I asked to quote him on it later, he says, "No, please don't." But a well-known gay man says to me, "Paddy, this is going to be a disaster because with a condom, it's visible. With PrEP, you have to take somebody's word." And
Yeah.
he says, when a man is looking to get with a partner or whatever, or have sex with a person, he might even lie. He might even say, of course, some PrEP. And this well-known actor, he's turned out to be completely right. So I wrote to RTE. Well, I was actually working on the Sean O'Rourke show in the mid-morning at that time. But I said, we need to carry, no, no. And eventually, no, you have to take, it's being sent up to management. Eventually, I got called in by Peter Woods, head of radio, and says, this is totally toxic, was the word he said. You don't touch this, okay? Saying, wow, we're journalists. I'm looking at all this public money that is being suddenly put into this extraordinary thing. Oh, no, no, no. The gay flag gets flown and RTE falls over. And this reminded me that, and I was banned, if you like, because I had history with the gays going back 30 years, you know? But the trans thing reminds me of it very much, that a lobby group, a powerful lobby group, has put down the parameters that are acceptable for journalism and what we're allowed to talk about and what we're not allowed to talk about, and the terms of reference, and the way instantly our journalists are using expressions like trans women, and, they're reporting on Graham Linehan, who attacked a young teenage girl there in, and everybody knows that a man on woman dispute is very different to a man on man dispute.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know
I saw
that,
you talking about that. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
like I'm not a big man, but I'm bigger than most women. I'm probably bigger than you, Russian. I'm trying to think now.
You
We're
are.
about, I know. Yeah. So, like, everybody knows that man on woman is different to man on man. And what happened between Graham Linehan and that fellow was man on man, but the
Right.
media, our media, made out Linehan to be some kind of, misogynistic
Yeah.
bully. Like,
Yeah.
no,
And
which the
it
opposite
changes
way.
the whole
It does
thing
change the entire
shifts.
perspective. Well, I like that. And when a woman gets beaten up in a domestic violence refuge, that changes the whole vibe. So it does remind me of it that these parameters are there.
I want to talk about what you said there, a lobby group decides. Well, I have a slightly different take on it. In loads of cases, yes, the lobby group decides, but I think in the case of gender, and that includes the HIV/AIDS issue, it includes the trans issue, it includes a few different topics. I don't think it's the lobby groups just or alone. It is government policy because it's tied to so many international agreements. The Irish government is dancing to a tune outside of Ireland. I think the clearest example that I've ever seen of this was, do you remember there was the big discussion about the hate speech bill and it was terrible. The early draft was terrible, or the first draft was terrible, and then they walked it back. And then the government all flew to New York for the UN Global Summit on the whatever thing. And before the plane even touched down on the way back, they had reversed and gone back to the original version. I'm absolutely convinced that our government has no power over any of this stuff, and that they are, because I don't know if people know this, but our governments are under constant monitoring by international bodies. And to just give you an example, I had a look yesterday how many international organizations or international bodies, or even ones with like legal power, have criticized or commented on the UK Supreme Court decision ruling that a woman has a biological meaning. And the list was so long. You had something from the Council of Europe and the Council of Europe's Women's Rights Committee, and from the Special Rapporteur on this, and you had from the UN this, and the UN that, and the UN the other thing. And what happens is all these ministers and their teams, they go into meetings constantly where they sit down and they learn their grades about how they've done on such and such a thing. So you'll have an international agreement, a treaty, a convention, and a memorandum of understanding, a this, a that, a compact is a new one. And there's a monitoring and a reporting part of it. So somebody's responsible for reporting to these people and saying, right, we've rated you badly on this or well on this. And what's awful is that the lobby groups are also involved in that process. So the lobby groups are allowed to report to the international mechanism how their government is doing, because you can't rely on the government to do all the reporting on themselves. So you've got this weird thing where even if the Irish government wanted to walk back some of this stuff, I just don't think they can take the international pressure of it. And the international pressure is happening in very real meetings and in very real reports where they literally get graded on this stuff. So if I think that back in the day, you know, especially with AIDS, because defeating AIDS is such a global project. It's a borderless thing. It's one of the things where you can see the traces of this these international mechanisms all over the place, because the goal is international, 2030, end AIDS by 2030, or by 2030 have this particular set of things met. And they're all being graded on it constantly. And Ireland doesn't have the power to say, okay, whoa, 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 stop this. All Ireland has the power to do is be very good at it, and then maybe get favors in other ways then on other things that they consider more important. So you've seen Tenny, the Irish trans rights organizations, the state of them, they all look like sickly children.
I know.
I
That's
don't,
very
I,
disturbing, Russian. Yes, yeah. No, but I think you're right that if you can say, oh, well, it's best international practice, that kind of takes the responsibility off people from doing that. And things like, oh, well, Tenny says it. I mean, I'll tell you about Tenny, for example, when that story I told you about of the woman getting beaten up in the DVE shelter, one of the things that the Dublin City Council said to me is, we look after all women, and these are among the most vulnerable of women, are trans-identified women, but we have been also, our staff have undergone training from Tenny, you know?
oof.
So Dublin City Council and presumably other local authorities in Ireland as well are paying this group to train their staff. And those staff would have said, oh, you have a trans woman. Of course, the best thing for her is she be put in the DV refuge, with women. And the welfare of the women didn't matter at all, to
Did
Tenny.
you
Go ahead,
ever
yeah.
speak to did you speak to staff working in those places on the ground, or did you mostly
Both.
only hear from people in
Dublin City
offices?
Council. I also wrote to the Novus Hostel, which is the name of it. And again, they wrote back to me and said, we don't discuss individual cases. However, and it was something very similar about the most vulnerable of women, and this is our mission. And of course, and she says to me, of course, there will sometimes be violent incidents or trouble or disagreements, but this is inevitable. And I said, well, yes, of course, you're right. There's often, people
Mm,
are forced to live
mhm.
cheek by jowls. There are often people with addiction issues or mental health issues. People are
Mental
out of,
health.
yeah, all of that. People, fellas who've been barred from beating up their wives and stuff like that. There's all sorts of people you get in hostels. But what you didn't have until now is gendered violence going on inside domestic violence refuges or inside women's hostels. Gendered violence, I mean, man on woman violence. And the woman at the receiving end of those punches or whatever, she makes no mistake. She knows damn well what punching down is. And you said they just go along with the formulas that are there that have been agreed from above.
But listen, I had a conversation with a woman recently, one of the most disturbing conversations I ever had. It was a woman who wanted to foster a child who was in care in Scotland, and she was refused because she's gender critical. But so she had this whole entire exchange with two levels above her in the chain of the decision-making chain about getting her off the list as a foster parent because she has bad views on trans people, whatever. Which she didn't say anything negative, just to be clear, about trans people. She just said she thought that the Kira Bell case in the UK was good, that was settled now. That was a red flag for the foster organization to take her off the list. But she spoke to the person buffer who's like a counselor, a social worker who is in contact, daily contact with people in vulnerable situations. But the decision came from the level above her, which was the person in the office with the degree, in the master's degree and the PhD in social work. And what was disturbing to me about all that was that these are people who should know more than anyone why gender identity is a bad idea in law. So I would like to know from you, to what extent are the people who are actually on the ground and working with these vulnerable people think one way, and is it the same as the admin, or is it very different, or what have you observed?
Well, the people in the admin aren't going to say, are they? The experience I have on the ground is, as my podcast listeners will know, I spend quite a lot of time standing outside the criminal courts of justice in Dublin. I generate a lot of stories from there. Members of the Garda Síochána, that's the police force, we call them the guards here in Ireland. If you're in, they frequently come up to me and say, "Keep it up, Paddy. You're
Mhm.
right too. This is ridiculous," you know. And people generally, they're captured in the civil service levels for the reasons that you say, and it's very disturbing the picture that you paint, but it fits in exactly with what I'm observing, and it's interesting to see it put that way. But what beats the hell out of me is, why do journalists allow themselves to be captured? Where we
They
should
come
be
from
the
the same
ones.
universities, don't they? They didn't
Well,
go to the
they
Paddy
do.
O'Gorman School
The
of
gutter
Stand at a
journalists
place.
they literally stand at the gutter and I go, stand there and see what happens, you know? Yeah, well, perhaps that's it. Well, I mean, I've written to our health minister, Jennifer Carroll McNeil, who says about, she defends men or trans women in women's spaces, and the solipsism in which she says, neither I nor any woman with whom I am personally acquainted has ever been troubled by a trans woman in
Oh, good
their
for
place.
you.
Good for you. You couldn't be more lofty, you know? And she repeated as much last December in the Dáil when she says, "Did you ever hear anything so nonsensical that a man might first of all dress up as a woman before he'll beat up a woman?" Now, I've been monitoring, the cases where you have a Barbie Kardashian of a guy ended up being charged with sexually abusing women, which he was acquitted of, come back to that if you want. And you had the Kavanaugh case in which a man was convicted of it. Now, we all know that convictions are only the tip of the iceberg. You know, that for every
Yeah.
man who gets charged with beating up a woman in a refuge, but all the other men going around with their manhood clearly visible through the G-strings and the presence of violent men in a refuge. Of course, the whole way in which the trans lobby has eroded women's rights is stunning to me. Did you have the leader of the main opposition party, Mary Lou McDonald, trying to keep her party in order on this one? Do we need to cop on trans rights there, she said in an interview in January. But she's saying it should be on a case-by-case basis when we decide if a man should come into a women's prison. So, like, there was a time, if a man said he wants to get into a women's changing room, women didn't have to argue it. But now the leader of the opposition is there saying, "Oh, what is it about this particular man that you think?" And women have to make an argument for it in every case.
Mhm.
That's how far the thing
Brutal.
has come. It
I
is.
know.
It's brutal. But the public is not on side with it. And Mary Lou McDonald is a pragmatic politician, and she's trying to damp the thing down now. She's sacked Warfield, who was a very much Senator Warfield, as
Oh,
their gay
did you?
spokesman. Well, he's lost his seat in the Shannon, but it was quite interesting there about a year ago, 2 years ago maybe, the way that they removed all the Warfield documents off their website, which had been a trans manifesto. And the most telling part for them was when the Cass review came out there. What was that, about 18 months ago now? The British government suspended the use of puberty blockers. The Labour Party replaced the Tories in Britain, and they kept that ban going. The Northern Ireland executive, which is a power sharing executive within the United Kingdom, but it includes Sinn Féin plus unionist parties, unionist politicians, they instantly implemented the ban, even though that was in direct contradiction to Sinn Féin policy, in direct contradiction to the right wing party's policy, and it goes very much to the left wing party's policy here in the Republic of Ireland. So Sinn Féin has partitioned itself now. The north of the border, it supports a ban on puberty blockers. South of the border, in the Republic of Ireland, it is still very much in favour of gender-affirming care, although saying it more quietly. It's utter pragmatism, utter cynicism.
It's done a lot of damage to a lot of political parties. It's totally messed up. Yeah.
It has. And that's why we need to make them scared. They scare nothing. They fear nothing like this. They fear people knowing about what they're doing. The whole thing. But why is the media so complicit in this is what beats the hell out of me, you know?
This is the question. I mean, I try to think in my own life, have I done that about other topics? This is the only way I stay
Yeah,
sane. And I might have done that. I might be doing it right now about certain
yeah,
topics. If somebody came up to my face and said, "Do you not care that XYZ is happening?"
yeah,
I'd be like, "Well, look, I don't have multiple departments taking care of various
yeah.
issues in me. I only have time and energy for one thing, and this is really bad." What I wanted to ask you about today, though, and I'm going to lay the groundwork for what I want to talk about just by explaining a little bit of background, is in particular the Irish government's complicity in the what we can I think we can fairly call Irish trans medical tourism. So you've written about this recently, and I want to hear about why you wrote about it and what you found. But so to explain a little bit the context here, Ireland is part of the EU, which means that we have all kinds of rights across the border in other countries. One of those rights is the ability to get reimbursed for medical care under certain conditions. This is called a cross-border directive, or people
Yeah.
know it as the treatment abroad
The
scheme.
treatment of our scheme, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So I've spent the last couple of years, I probably out myself by saying this, but I've spent the last few years lurking in a lot of Facebook groups, Discord groups, and on Reddit, which is public, and looking at what Irish people are doing in terms of getting trans healthcare, as it's euphemistically called. And what I noticed was there's one surgeon in particular who's very, very popular. There's about four among Irish people. And again, as you put it, it's mostly women. There were more breasts being amputated than penises, I think is how you said it. It's mostly women, and they're mostly going to a doctor in Madrid, and they're getting their breasts removed. And it looks very much like the Irish government is paying for it. And let me just say before I let you speak, I noticed that it was about 1,000,000, just under 1,000,000 in total has been spent. I think that probably does include trips to the UK for the hormone stuff. So we don't have any kind of breakdown, do we? Tell me, why did you want to look into this issue, Paddy?
Well, I was shocked. It was an independent TD, Ken O'Flynn, in Cork. And actually, sorry, he's joined a party now called Independent Ireland. And he immediately actually was on Facebook. I had, because I know I don't sound, I'm actually from Cove in County Cork. My childhood was in England, you know, but I had people in my hometown of Cove writing to me saying, Ken O'Flynn's a gay man. He's a disgrace to be letting down his community like this. To me, it didn't matter. But Ken O'Flynn is his own man, obviously. But he put in a parliamentary question because he's a TD, that's a member of the Irish Parliament, a member of the Dáil. He put in a parliamentary question to the health minister about how much are we spending on trans surgeries when we're sending people abroad. And the results were quite shocking that it had gone up 17-fold in just 2 years. I don't have the figures in front of me. And it was actually for some reason, which I can't explain. I hope O'Flynn gets more information on this. It's the cost of what we're doing has gone right up. So there was nearly never refusals. And one of the interesting things I found, if you look into the rules of it, to qualify for the Irish taxpayer to pay for treatments abroad for Irish people, it has to not be an experimental or procedure. One of the specifications is that it should not be for clinical trials of any sort.
Mhm.
It has to be
Mhm.
well-established treatments. So since
Yeah.
when did cutting off people's healthy body parts become a well-established treatment? And then when you see it, we have, as I was talking about our health minister earlier, who doesn't know any women who've ever been troubled by trans women, as she puts it. Her junior minister is Mary Butler, and she's also the government chief whip, or she's the junior health minister with responsibility for mental health. Butler stood up in the Dáil last June for Pride Week, and in a tearful address explained, I have a transgender son. In other words, she has a daughter who would be, I think, about 20 years of age now, but for the last few years, that daughter has been saying, Mom, I'm really a boy. And Mary Butler, she's put her own teenage kid out there into the public realm by saying,
Yeah.
there is no better guide for public policy than lived experience.
Mhm.
Now, unlike Mary Lou McDonald, whose brother says he's a girl, Mary Lou McDonald
Mhm.
says it wouldn't shake party policy. Well, in the case of our health minister, junior health minister, Mary Butler, she's quite clear and plain that her teenage kids' experience does shape government policy. Now,
Yeah.
what did Butler say? Last December, she gave an interview saying, I am doing whatever I can behind the scenes to help young people get the trans healthcare that they need. And I think when you look at that, you can kind of see the hand of Mary Butler. Is that and it's
And
so ironic. Yeah,
sorry to interrupt, I saw her on LinkedIn, or I saw somebody else on LinkedIn, because this is where they post where they think that we won't find them because nobody's on LinkedIn because it's cringe. She was in
yeah,
Luxembourg and she was in, I think it was Spain, basically two of the worst, oh, Malta. She was
right.
in the worst places for this, the most the loosest trans affirming
Yes.
healthcare countries, and I think she was there to get tips and tricks on
I'm sure she was,
how
yeah.
to do
She
it.
says,
Yeah.
"I'm doing it behind the scenes." But
Yeah.
she's utterly motivated, like in tears in the doll, talking about
Yeah.
how it's young people, we
Oh, I
have to
would be
treat them as
too.
humans. So, yeah.
If I did that
And
to
the
my daughter, I'd
irony,
be too.
one of the things I did, I made TV programs on this too, but I always found tattoos fascinating. Stand in Belfast, say, and talk to people about their tattoos. And there was a rule came in Northern Ireland over 50 years ago that you couldn't get a tattoo if you were under 18 years of age, largely because it was
Really?
often sectarian things that were there. But we
Ah,
still actually don't have such a law in the Republic of Ireland, but apparently it's custom and practice, I'm told, by tattoo artists. They will look for your birth cert for your passport or whatever. But Mary Butler, is about 7 years ago, 2018, 8 years ago now, she had a private member's bill when she was a backbench TD before she was a minister to ban tattoos on people under the age of 18
Jesus.
on the very good reason that people under that age aren't capable of consenting to a
Jesus.
body altering procedure. I remember it in Belfast, fellas would have had, F the Pope, and so they put on something like Manchester United across it, or UVF they'd have, and they turn that into love. You stick in an L and then turn the U into an O, and then you cover in the E. But then Catholics were full said, he's got love in his hand. I was UVF. But people do stupid things when they're young and foolish. And Mary Butler fully understands that because out of nowhere she came up with this private members bill, which I would have fully supported her on. Unfortunately, it fell through lack of support. It was like private members' bills often do. She couldn't get her own party on side. But this is the same minister
That's
who thinks that
crazy.
you're too young to get a tattoo. And yet, like, had her daughter come to her and said, Mom, I think I want a tattoo, her mother would have said, No, you're too young. But her daughter comes to
Yeah.
her and says, I think I'm a boy or I am a boy. And she has had total affirmation from a
I'm
very
looking
powerful
I'm just looking to
person.
see now,
Mhm.
to see which country she was in and what she was talking about, but yeah, it's pretty sure she's doing a tour
She
around
was in
of places
Iceland
you.
as well with her
Yes,
civil servants, you
of
know? And
course.
again, apparently
Yeah,
Iceland is well known for having the
yeah,
most whatever positive things like
absolutely.
that. But you go back, we are making progress. If you look at the program for government 2020, and that was the axis of Leo Varadkar and Simon Harris, the present leader of Fine Gael, and obviously Fianna Fáil went into it as well because they were a coalition of the centre-right parties. It was like a trans manifesto. It was
Yeah.
affirmative action. It was, the whole lot.
But she's gonna
It
do
was
that now, the mental health bill.
where she's going, but as she, to use her own word, behind the scenes
Yeah,
is her way of
yeah.
doing this in her own expression. And journalists, we need to call her out on this. We need to bring it
Yeah.
up that people's know. Now, can I tell you what happened this morning in Ireland? That we have
Oh,
TVAM, which
mhm.
is Virgin Media here in Ireland, which is the independent television station. And later on, we're going to have in Dr. Sive Gallagher, the Dundalk woman or Louth woman who is doing well in Miami. Up she comes. I actually videoed it on my phone, very crude video, and I put it. People who follow me on Twitter can see it. But and she's there saying, "Oh yeah, that now I'm moving into other types of plastic surgery." And I thought, "Come on, tell us
Paddy, can
about
you
cutting the
tell
breasts off."
listeners who she is, first of all? 'Cause
All
I'm
right,
not sure that everyone
she's
knows who she is.
Dr. Sive Gallagher. She's a woman from Dundalk. I became aware of her a few years back. Our Taoiseach Prime Minister got photographed with her, as the great because when he was a great champion of this is Simon Harris, great champion of the trans healthcare. And she calls herself Eat the Teats, that she has this and she advertises about and I think she's quoted as saying that nobody has ever refused trans healthcare on being too young. She cuts breasts off of teenage girls, and is very plain about this. I don't know how young the youngest are, but she was on this morning because For some reason, she's turning up in the Irish media a lot. The Irish Times did a total puff piece on her the other day without ever mentioning any of the controversy around only of having had a great career in
They
transforming
didn't say
healthcare.
anything about the controversy or the fact that
No,
the
they
she's
did.
nothing.
TV3
Oh,
did. I'm sorry, or Virgin Media, as it's called now. About 2, 3 minutes into the interview, they said, and of course, you've been known for trans healthcare. And now, unfortunately, this is becoming part of the culture wars. I'm paraphrasing the presenters here, that these transgender people are being othered now these days instead of being cared for as people. You're absolutely right. I mean, it was here's an open goal for you. And then you had Alan Hughes, and he disappoints me because he's a gay man in Irish broadcasting. And I did see him say a thing about PrEP. And actually, PrEP could be causing TIs. Nobody took him up on it, but I knew what he was talking about. But he just says something like, "You're so good what you do." Or it's very much the two of them. She's there, two Irish television presenters, and they're nodding at her. "Aren't you so wonderful? All that you do for transgender people." And that was it. It was like there is no hope on earth that Virgin Media would ever get on somebody like Stella O'Malley or Helen Joyce, or indeed somebody who was involved in the cast review, or when you have Finland and everybody else around the world rowing back on it. What does Irish media do? Does nothing but present this pop piece, which would leave viewers with very little idea what's going on. And it's in keeping with TV3. They were the same last Pride thing. Their presenter actually put on a Mammies for Trans Rights jersey when he was out on the street to interviewing the usual Mammies for Trans Rights people. And like TV3 generally, when the British Supreme Court ruling came in, you had the presenter there say, "Unfortunately, problems are looming in Britain." And then she say, "I personally would certainly have never had an issue with a trans woman being in a bathroom with me." And things like, under this now, this in Britain now, do you know a trans woman could be strip searched by a male police officer? Now, most people, even I have to do mental gymnastics. We say, what actually are we talking about here? Now, any average Irish decent listener or viewer would actually, when they were explaining, what you're talking about here is a bloke who says he's a woman and gets arrested for some reason. He's now going to be strip searched by male officers. Why, yet you want
uh-huh,
women to have to take this
uh-huh,
guy to strip search, which these guys would really love, wouldn't they? And I
mhm.
tell you, I have a mighty distaste for some of
Yeah,
these men.
you're
I don't
I can
care.
see you getting very animated about
No,
it. Me
but
too.
come here,
Yeah.
Roisin, I'm of an
I
age.
know.
When I was 17, my hair was rather like yours, about the same length. And that was a 50 years ago. I'm 69 now. 50 years ago, in the 1970s, that was a gender non-conforming thing to do. I played
Yeah.
bass guitar in quite a lot of rock bands around the Cork circuit at that time in my teenage years. I had long hair. And I remember the older generations say, "Oh, he's turning into a girl." And we were confident enough, but no, it's not changing our sex. We're simply gender non-conforming. That it became a thing that men can do as well. But here we are, like 50 years later, and
It's
they're
almost
mm, mm,
conservative, like, it's a
it
conservative
is
thing. It's a
conservative.
very
It
regressive
is.
thing to
It is
do.
conservative. But all my life, I never cared, Roisin, that there are some men, what the drag queens. There are men who like jump dancing, dressing up in women's underwear and prancing around in front of other men. You want to do that? I have zero interest. I have had
Mhm,
zero interest in that all my life. Then I discover, oh, you want to involve children? Now I'm interested. Now it's my
mhm.
business. You want to bring kids into this? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It is my business. And I will watch, and I've developed a mighty distaste for these guys. It was like gay rights. Fine. I supported gay rights. Back in 1975, I represented University College Cork. I was 18 at a gay rights conference in Belfast. And my mum said to me, "I didn't know this about you. Mom, it's not me. It's just there's no other students in Cork willing to go to this conference. And it was in
Mhm.
Queen's University, Belfast. I was 18 years old, simply to stand up for gay rights. Absolutely. It was a progressive cause. And actually, in student politics back in the 70s, most of it was rubbish that dissolved when you went outside the university gates. But gay rights
Mhm,
actually was a thing that university
mhm,
students did help to bring about, because it mattered.
mhm.
And the media was interested in it and stuff like that. Stuff to do with women's rights as well. University students did push,
Mhm.
those things, even though most of the kind of Ho Chi Minh stuff dissolved once you were outside the
Yeah.
college gates, kind of thing. It
Yeah.
evaporated. But I didn't care about any of this, all my
And
life.
you know
But you
what
look at
I
what's
found
happening now.
interesting this week? The LGB Alliance, which is this international sort of organization that's fighting back on the other side, is sort of saying lesbians, gays, bisexuals deserve
Oh,
rights and spaces to hang out together without being having this trans and queer stuff imposed on them, whatever. They submitted something to a UN body the women's UN body, I think. And it was an argument that I hadn't seen, I had heard made before, but nobody had ever made it in an official capacity, I don't think, which was the UN bodies claim that they're fighting against gender stereotypes because gender stereotypes are bad and they hold people back and they're destructive and they lead to abuse and all this stuff. Gender identity is gender stereotypes.
It's
And I think
exactly
they were
what
the
it is.
first, they were saying you can't from one side of your mouth say we're going to end stereotypes and then the other say, oh, it's if you have long hair and you feel girly, well then you're actually
You're
female.
really a
You know,
girl.
these
Yeah,
are
yeah,
contradiction in terms. I was really glad to see that argument finally made and
yeah.
fair play to them for doing that.
I'd like to see that. Yeah,
Um,
so in my day, we had David Bowie and Mark
yeah,
Bolan, and these were all gender non-conforming people. And
yeah.
it's funny, you have the present generation saying things like, "What's wrong with you, old folk? Didn't you have David Bowie? So what's your problem now?" David Bowie never claimed he was a woman. He simply
But
was a man who wanted to be non-conforming, and we all loved him for it, you know.
I think that maybe one of the things that contributed to this whole mess is when you were younger, toys and clothes were less gendered than they
That's
became.
right. Yeah.
They became really, it did become very
Uh,
pink and blue in the 80s, 90s as there was
did
more
it?
commerce, as there
Yeah.
was more don't you
Yeah.
think? Like, wouldn't it be a toy was a toy in the 70s and then by the end of the 80s a toy was
Right.
pink or it was blue. And we sort of
Yeah.
grew up with this, like, there's this is, everyone there have been gender stereotypes since forever. Girls do this, boys do that. But aesthetically, and there was an explosion. And before we ever got to the internet or social media or anything, there was very much. And what I find interesting about that is Maya Forstater, who we all know and love, who started Sex Matters and who won this famous tribunal in the UK. Before she was a TERF and before any of this happened, she had a campaign called "Let Toys Be Toys," and it was about degendering the toys. And if I remember correctly, sorry if I've got that wrong, I'll check it out. But yeah, it was the idea that you go into a shop and you have all the pink stuff on this side and all the blue stuff on that side. And she was just sort of like, let kids choose what toys they want to play with. And I wonder to what extent that very sort of that dichotomy sort of embedded something in the brains of a couple of generations of people especially people with autistic type of way of seeing the world, maybe that these are the codes. I
Yes.
like these codes, therefore that is me. I don't know.
I know what you mean by autistic type coding. You know, I know a little girl who recently she says to me, "The moon shouldn't be up in the day." You know, because she's coded the moon comes up at night, and yeah, she's about 6 by now, but she was about 4 when she said this to me, and that is in that mindset. I don't remember that. You see, I'm the youngest of 3 boys, so I grew up in North London. Arsenal didn't rub off on me. I never really went into football, but my dad and my 2 older brothers, well, my dad died many years back, but, obviously it was like boy toys. It was Fireball XL5, it was Supercar, it was, the '60s stuff. Funny, I remember my best friend was a little girl a few doors down, Susan, and she had a doll's house, and I was fascinated by the doll's house. Now, sensed even then at 6 or 7 years of age, I couldn't have asked my mom and dad for a doll's house. But in
Yeah.
these days, they probably would have said, "Oh, does he need to be gender
Yeah,
reassigned?"
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
this is the horror of what's
It's
happening now,
horrible, isn't it?
and it's horrible. And when I
You
think of it,
just
when I yeah, go on.
you just
Mhm.
need one person in the entourage of such a child who says, "Oh, I know what that is," and then everyone else has
Yes,
to shut up about it and say, "Okay," and go
yes.
along with it. This is so dangerous.
And there used to be an expression, "Oh, she's a tomboy." But nobody ever that meant she was a girl who liked playing football and not doing stereotypically girl things. She may have been gay, but nobody ever used to say, "Oh, she's really a boy." And when I think of it, when I used to play music with one particular woman, Tony, Jeanette, real powerful blues voice. Now, Tony did eventually come out as gay, and as far as I know, is living with a woman in Cork still. She'd be in her 70s now. But like that, she was always tomboyish, you know? But if you told Tony she was a man, she'd hit you. You know, of course she's a woman. She's a rather gender non-conforming woman with a powerful blues voice. Janis Joplin and up would have been her role model, I think, you know. But we didn't have that gender stereotyping.
Yeah. This is the part that makes me very angry. Yeah, this makes me super angry as well. So many things trigger me about this topic, but that's one of the big ones. It's so silly. But I'll tell you what I've seen with Irish women in the last few years in these groups is that there is an entire ecosystem of surgeries and hormones and stuff going on in parallel to the conversation about the National Gender Service. So I saw you in Dublin when we went to that Wicklow Women for Women event, and you
Yeah.
gave a really great talk. Well done. And
Thank you.
I went up to Stella afterwards. So Stella was talking about the NGS, the National Gender Service, and the rules and the laws and the this and the that. And I was like, Stella, but you don't realize there's an entire parallel universe going on of people buying these hormones online and stuff. And she was like, no, I know there is, but we're sort of trying to establish what should be done, but what's actually going on is an entire different story. And she's right. So there were two tracks. One is, what does the state allow? What does it reimburse? What does it consider acceptable? What evidence does it base it on? But apart from that, there's an entire world. And I don't think people realize the extent to which people are going ahead. Nobody's getting, very few people are getting their care from the National Gender Service in Ireland. They're getting it in Madrid, and they're getting it in Warsaw, and they're getting it in all these cities, and they're buying it online from these different various places, and most of them aren't getting their money back. So what you discovered, or what Ken O'Flynn discovered, and what
Yeah.
you wrote about, was this sort of overlap where the girls in the groups managed to convince the HSE to reimburse them
Yeah.
for the surgeries by convince this is what I suspect anyway. I mean, the National Gender Service can't provide the care, I have to say, the euphemistic
Yeah. I
care,
know.
because of the long waiting list, but also because they need specialist treatment. So they're sending some people to England. So I assume a lot of that cost, or some of that cost, was covering the cost of sending these children abroad, and it's covered under the treatment abroad scheme. But I have seen in these groups that some of these girls are getting their breasts amputated, and they are getting their money back from this law, through this law, and they're being helping each other to how to get it. And Noah Halpin, and I hope this isn't libelous, but it's true. I have screenshots. Noah Halpin is who was in a photograph with the Taoiseach and Sive Gallagher, the butcher
Outside
from
Gallagher,
Miami.
yes, seen that, yeah,
This
yeah,
woman, Noah Halpin, who pretends to be a man, is one of the people in those groups helping them get their money back and giving them their options. And she's working
yeah,
behind the scenes very much with Mary
yes,
Butler, I'd say, on getting this thing
yeah,
formalized.
and they know because I wrote to help in there. It was about 3 years ago in the Journal of Medicine in Ireland. There was an article, I can send it to you if you like, and Irish Journal of Medicine, I think it is, yeah. It's a two-monthly publication, but it was about cross-sex hormones and drugs that are being given. And I had a fascinating art line in it, in which it said, effects on fertility should be considered permanent. And that's there in black and white. And one of the people who's consulted in that is Noah Halpin, who, and I wrote to Halpin. I tell you when it came up is when Roisin Murphy, the singer, said that it was wrong to be giving kids these drugs. And Halpin, she writes an scathing attack on Roisin Murphy. And with that, that encouraged me because I'd read this article and which Halpin had been consulted. And I said, hold on, Noah, you know this very well that if you give teenagers these drugs, no matter what else it does, consider them to no longer be able to have babies, or I think it was to father babies as
Yeah.
well. And of course,
So
you know what
Roisin Murphy
Halpin.
is right. You know,
Yes, Sir Roisin Murphy is right. So Noah Halpin, who I wrote in good faith to, as somebody who's being consulted on this healthcare, did what these people always do. They block you. You know, boom, you were blocked from, because I used to read Halpin, and I find that time and again, they only want their own echo chamber and they block you out. And I wrote, as I say, to Halpin in good faith, and it was blocked. And I say this morning we have a TV3, or sorry, Virgin Media as it's called now. There's no attempt to tell the public what's really going on or to raise the questions. And I was written on it a good few years back, and I take, but on yeah.
with your experience in media, like, to what extent behind the scenes do you think this glaring omission of not considering, and for example, not both sides, not having, representatives of Stella and Helen Joyce and all that stuff, not having those people to represent the other side, but also just knowing that the common sense among the plebs, is going to immediately sense something up here. To what extent do you think that this conversation is going on behind the scenes? Because I can only imagine that every time they have to publish, like, I can only imagine the drama about that Sive Gallagher thing, which they eventually pulled it, didn't they? I mean, do you think the conversation
Yeah, the article in the Irish Times, I saw somebody saying it was pulled, but I logged onto the Irish Times and I could still
is
see it
still
there.
there?
I
Right.
believe they they've stopped comments on it or something like that. So I might have been doing it. I think on their Twitter page they've stopped comments on it or whatever. Yeah.
To what extent do you think editors are sort of freaking out about this? You know, to what extent are they saying, "Oh my god, everyone knows and nobody will say it?" Like,
Yeah,
what?
we're not going there. Well, it's obviously clearly happening to a very large extent in RTE, in the Irish Times, the Indo, all across the newspapers. Some of them are absolute. I think with Virgin Media, they're enthusiastic. They're zealots for all of this.
Okay.
I don't know with RTE where they are, but one way or another, they collapse. Like we had a man put on a dress there last August in Cincinnati, and he went into a church and he opened fire gunning down a number of children. I think he killed two of them before he put the gun on himself. Even now, if you look at the RTE News website, that man has no sex. He is a shooter. You know, this is basic journalism. You know, if the man is arrested, you report it. If a woman is killed in an accident, you report it. What happens? RTE decides to tear up the most basic journalistic rulebook so as not to offend the trans community. Let's not mention that this shooter was a man in a dress, you know, and gives this name Robin Westman, which is obviously it could be either gender. So like RTE has no self-respect at this
What
stage.
do you think the editors and the heads of RT like, what do you think the conversations are that are going on? This fascinates me. What's your best guess as to how they're what are they just saying, "Let's just never ever mention it. It's taboo," or do you think they're
Yes, it is. Well, I was told about the word that was used to me was toxic regarding prep, you know, so as I say, I actually wasn't conscious of the trans thing when I was in RTE. It was only beginning, but once COVID then came and it shut down all of my ways of working. But once COVID was over and the prison visiting started again, I went to Willamette Prison and started talking to women there about because you get women signing on, you know, people who are out on temporary release. So that's his way of meeting prisoners and visitors who have been in there. And I'm getting all these stories about women are being subjected to rape threats, sexualized abuse, all of which was confirmed in his own sworn testimony when he was up in court for it. You know, yes, he has this slightly American accent. But I went to an RTU journalist who I like. I thought, but I respected him. Traveled a long way to his home and said to him, "We really need to cover this." And I played him the stuff that I'd taken outside Limerick Prison because they won't touch me, but they would touch him. And the word he says to me, "Paddy, that's totally toxic." You know? So what is it? Career comes first, whatever. That's so there's a mixture. I think it's a small number of zealots and a large number of cowards is in
right.
our media. Same as
A pinch of
in
zealotry, a huge dose of cowardice. Yeah, that sounds like
cowardice. And it's
the
the same in
yeah.
the medical profession that you could see, for example, like one thing I probably about 4 years ago there, I got the Blood Transfusion Service Board to revise its transgender guidelines because it made no sense. I
Yeah.
first gave blood
Was it
in
oh my god, I remember
1978.
that. It was
Yeah, I
brutal.
was
Yeah.
21 years old. My then boss, I was working in the Department of Health. My then boss was Charles Haughey, TD, was the health minister, and he encouraged us all to go and give blood. So I went and gave blood. So I've been giving blood since 1978. When I went to give blood I went to give blood in Hiya. Sorry, my wife's just come back. When did I go to give blood? When I retired. And I went onto the health service, the blood service, and they had all these questions for cisgender, whatever, about being pregnant. And it was for cisgender women and transgender. I can't even remember it, but I had to write to them. I
It
said,
was
look,
very bad. Yeah, it was really, really
what
bad.
is
I
the
remember.
difference? What is a pregnant transgender man? What's a pregnant transgender woman? What's the difference between them? And after then we had backwards and forwards. And next thing they totally collapsed and on it, which I'm glad of, and wrote an apology and said, "We're very sorry. You should never have been asked this, and we've corrected it." But what it showed to me was that the doctors themselves simply took their instructions from probably Tenny or somebody like that, you
Yeah,
know? And I tell you, it
yeah.
was Tenny because when I first wrote to them, to the Blood Board, they said to me, "We do our very best. We'll send you our guidance, and you could also consult with Tenny." You know, this is a Blood Transfusion Service Board sent me to Tenny. Same as the Dublin City Council sent me to Tenny. You know, where is all the level of the state? That you look at their figures, you're going, yeah,
The thing
sorry,
is about I would love if Tenny just stopped getting money because then
yes, indeed. Yeah. So you
but
look
the
at
thing
our
is the
you
government
look at our
is
health
giving them money.
services. It is. But you know, we have health statistics. I'm looking at the health statistics on monkeypox. and which is overwhelmingly a male affliction. And you'll see in the middle of the most recent annual report on monkeypox, this is according to gender identity. If you want to know more about this, Teddy can be asked. This is in an official document reports. Consult with Teddy. You know, the HIV figures now, again, for what they call gender identity. In other words, we're having an increase in the number of women becoming HIV positive in Ireland because these days, gay men have always called themselves straight men. You can see that because far too many straight men are among the straight people.
Is
Men
not.
massively outnumber women among Irish people, which means it's gay men who are lying. Unless there's
Mhm.
something weirdly infectious about the Irish
I
vagina or something. But now
I
they
thought
can
that
actually
I thought
fake
it's because
they're faking the
immigration,
document.
which is another
Yes, that
layer
is true. But I'm
of.
talking among Irish people. If you break it down among Irish people and immigrants, of course, immigration is boosting HIV figures. It is. So I've always found it an interesting exercise, and I've been doing this for 30 years, to separate out the Irish figures. In other words, or I should say, infections abroad versus infections in
Mhm.
Ireland. I'm the
Right,
only
right.
journalist in
Yeah,
Ireland who has ever
yeah.
done that because every other journalist was perfectly happy to conflate the two and say, isn't it terrible? We really need to be using condoms more, as if condoms could affect immigration, do you know? But
Come here.
go on, yeah.
There's a few factoids about HIV that I've learned down through the years that are absolutely shocking. One of them, in relation to something you were saying earlier, the criminalization of the transmission of HIV. That's one of the big things on the list. So there's a big list of things to change the transmission of HIV, and one of them is obviously the stigma is number one. Number two, I mean, there's not a list like that, but I mean, there's no order of priority in that way. But another one is decriminalize the transmission of HIV. Now, this has been a huge thing. So, as you were saying with PrEP, you don't know when you ask someone, are you on PrEP? Whether they're lying or not. So, it has been one of the missions, one of the objectives is to decriminalize it totally so that you cannot prosecute somebody who knowingly or unknowingly gave you HIV, which was always the case in the past. So it was seen as a lethal weapon in the past. So if you infected some, you would maybe kill them, eventually kill them, or you would spread it to other people who would die. So it was considered a crime. The AIDS organizations want to stop that being a crime because they think hold on, I remember what is the rationale again? The rationale is it might prevent people going to get more PrEP or stop them taking PrEP, or I can't
Oh,
remember.
Lord.
The logic
Yeah.
sometimes clicks in and sometimes it escapes me. But so some countries have done what they're told and they've decriminalized completely, but other countries are hanging
Mm.
on and saying, right, but we're making an exception for when it's knowingly transmitted. So many things like that. Same with the decriminalization of prostitution. That's an AIDS goal. Same with the gender identity stuff. This is a unique population that needs to be identified and targeted. And that's what supercharged the funding many years ago for organizations that target trans people, which is how we got to where we are today, I think. But so there's prostitution, there's transmission. The worst one, the one that shocks people the most, I think, is that one of the objectives, and this has been enacted in a number of countries, and the example I know best is France, is that if you're an asylum seeker and you test positive for HIV, you get to stay. And the reason
Uh-huh.
is then you're on the health radar. Then you're on the radar for
Ah.
coming for your checkups and you're getting your PrEP. So I first heard about this a few years ago when a friend of mine who lives near a gay hotspot in Paris was telling me that she had heard a rumor that people, now take this with a pinch of salt, that men were going there and deliberately having sex with infected people in order to test positive for HIV and get to stay because all you have to do is take PrEP every day. It's not a lethal disease anymore. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but
True,
I have
yeah.
heard
That
other
might not
things
be the
about it. That
yeah.
might not be true, but this is definitely true. There was a case where a guy was right, follow this now. The guy was from Ivory Coast. He was going to the hospital on their behalf. So he was going to the hospital with the paperwork of another guy, getting a blood test, being found to be HIV positive, and then the people were getting to stay in France as a result of his HIV positive test. And he did it hundreds of times before he got caught. When somebody twigged that this is all the same blood from the same guy, and the people were paying him, and if you were female, you had to pay the female one. So he found a woman who was HIV positive, who was able to go into the hospital. So he went into hospital 100 times with the paperwork of other men in order to get them to stay in France. And he was found and he was prosecuted for it. So, and that's because France will allow you to stay in France if you test HIV positive. And again, it's a harm reduction thing,
Yeah.
quote unquote. And so this is how far things have gone in order
Gone, yeah.
to
Yeah. I
achieve
find
this
all of
goal of
that plausible. But you find that same complicit thing. I mean, it's reading you yesterday, how much of a connection there is going back with between AIDS and the trans thing. That you have it like that in Ireland, about 9 out of 10 of our HIV cases now are acquired abroad or who lived abroad. So we don't know if they're acquired abroad. That's, that's a newsworthy piece of news.
Yep,
It's
it really is.
obscured time and time
Yeah.
again. They use a formula where it says new existing diagnoses and new diagnoses. Existing diagnoses means somebody came into the country. About 9 out of 10 are existing diagnoses, but they disguise that fact. No, and next thing you're anti-immigrant or something. No, our job, we're journalists. Our job is to find out what's going on and blurt it out to tell the people what's going on. Instead of that, so many journalists think they're here to make the world a better place. And the stigma one's very interesting as well. I was puzzled by this 30 years ago or 25 years ago when I first started losing work over AIDS. Oh, you're spreading stigma. And I'd be there thinking, hold on, let's take it. Look at the figures, STI figures. I think the biggest STI in Ireland right now, I think it's chlamydia. And it's white-skinned Irish people is the biggest, the single most notified one. Nobody has ever said to me, do you know we need to fight chlamydia stigma? That's the way to beat chlamydia. People catch chlamydia through being careless with their sexual health. And yet uniquely, for HIV, it's stigma. I mean, why should there not be a stigma? If people want to keep it to themselves, like you have all this thing, like if somebody has HIV, oh, don't have a stigma, be upfront about it. Okay, what if you have some other STI? Supposing you have genital warts. Supposing you have rectal gonorrhea. Am I meant to tell everybody about that too? I think people are entitled to have the stigma. And you know, nobody ever comes up with this thing say, "Let's beat the stigma of gonorrhea." You know, no, you beat gonorrhea by being careful with your sexual health. Yeah, yeah.
A parallel
Go from
story,
here.
just so people don't think we're unfairly going after HIV and AIDS and gay men or
Sure.
anything, but I worked in a health funding organization for the European Commission for about 3 years, and we had a big project that we were funding, and it was about tuberculosis, and the cases of tuberculosis were on the rise in Europe. And why was that? And it was because of these huge camps on the border of Europe in Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, all that stuff. So TB was circulating there and it was coming into Europe via that way. So that's a news story. So I worked in communications. When we were talking about that project, which was worth millions, we couldn't. I remember the head of the organization saying, we need to be very careful about this because it's very sensitive. Because the TB, as soon as people hear the TB is on the rise, they're going to say, where's it coming from? And then they find out, and then it generates other negative emotions
Yeah,
about
yeah.
immigration. And, it's sort of like saying there's a big bunch of diseased people over there, and you can sort of understand, like, do we want to create a situation? I mean, I'm not telling you I know what the solution is, but do we want to create a situation where you say, right, when you see a Syrian walking down the street, you can assume he comes from a Lebanese camp that's riddled with TB. We don't want, then the Syrian will never get a job, and then he'll be homeless, and then this, da, 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 it's a very pragmatic sort of response.
My own conscience on this, as far as I'm concerned, I'm the anti-racist who for the last 30, 40 years has been saying, actually, if an African person has TB, what makes you believe that that man caught the TB because he caught a virus through his penis? There's lots and lots of other, like TB is the major AIDS defining disease of Africa.
Yes.
I'm looking
Yes.
at my own. And you hear all these people say, oh, I've seen AIDS. How have you seen AIDS? You and I could walk into Dublin now and I'll meet drug addicts, okay, in Dublin city centre. Some of those will be HIV positive. If you ask them about it, they'll tell you. But you do a thing called an HIV test to know that. You can't tell to look at somebody if they're HIV positive. And yet you have journalists and pop stars and politicians wandering around Africa say, we've seen AIDS. They see poverty. They see people living in appalling conditions, no decent water supply or anything else. And I'm looking at it like we have our census in Ireland the other day, but the last year or two, I've been doing a bit of ancestry tracing myself. I'm looking in Cove, my hometown, Queenstown as it would have been, very, very overcrowded conditions. And I'm looking at my grandfather's siblings, my father's father. He was one of six. Three of those died in the year 1910, 11, around their late 20s, early 30s. Mary, my great uncle Paddy O'Gorman, and another man, Margaret, another woman, Margaret. Every single one of them was ficus pulmonaris. They died of TB.
Consumption.
Consumption, as it was called. And you look at it, I looked at the house they were living in, it's quite near the seafront in Cove, but then you realize there was six families there. And there was lodgers who would be going to emigrating to the USA or Britain from, Queenstown Wake, as it was called. And you realize in those living conditions, that spread very quickly. So young
Yeah.
adults were dying. My great auntie Mary had a young family. Mary Pumphrey was her name, and I'm looking at all of that. I'm realizing just not too long ago in Ireland. So if you have AIDS researchers would have come at that time, they would have seen AIDS. And wherever AIDS researchers go, they're like witchcraft finders. They will find AIDS.
I'm trying to figure out what you're saying here. What do you mean?
I'm saying that they are calling. I'm the one who says, no, Africans aren't all venereally diseased. These are simply diseases of poverty, unless you can explain to me properly why you think that every single African man caught a virus through his penis. How do you know that, to look at him? The blanket way. And if you try to say, well, hold on, maybe there's other explanations for what you call AIDS, this lock, and then, you're a denialist and all the rest of it. So naturally, you have the basic racism of the thing saying, well, that's the Africans, that they can't constrain their sexual urges, not like us white guys, us white people. And so you have all of that stigma coming with black people when they come into, say, Ireland, say, I'm looking at these beautiful African women over the years and thinking, do they really have a deadly virus lurking around in their panties? It's disgusting stuff. Disgusting. And journalists just simply took it. And there was a whole industry, like the witch finding industry 300 years ago, 400 years ago. If you set up a witch finding industry, you will find witches. And so when it comes to it, as far as I'm concerned, I have simply questioned the racist assumptions. And the usual one I would get then is, it's the position of women in Africa. All right, so if you like your racism with a bit of feminist sugarcoating, maybe that would be it. But like we in Ireland, us white-skinned Irish people, we're getting plenty of other STIs. And when
Yeah.
presumably women are in such a much better position, it hasn't stopped chlamydia or anything else spreading around in Ireland. Sorry, maybe I'm not making myself clear, but I mean, I've been accused of racism now by saying like we should report it when TB is being brought or HIV is coming out due to immigration.
Right, but
That is the
are you
major.
saying
Mhm.
are you saying that what we're calling HIV/AIDS might not be HIV/AIDS at all?
I'd
I
say,
didn't
well,
follow the earlier
yeah, okay.
controversy about
Well,
what you
AIDS
wrote
is a
about it.
syndrome, okay?
Yeah.
Acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It's not a discrete illness in itself. It's a
Yeah.
syndrome of immune deficiency. And okay, they've decided in Africa that every that HIV, which has manifestly not spread among people in the Western world, is spreading rapidly in Africa. Now, by 2012, I thought it was quite startling. If you look at the UN AIDS report for 2012, it said as much. It said that as a generalized or heterosexual disease, AIDS is confined to Southern Africa. Why would that be? Which brings you back 12 years earlier to the Thabo Mbeki's Patrick Pearse speech in May of 2000, when he quoted the poet Patrick Pearse and said, as the wise men have not spoken, I speak who am just a fool. Being a fool, I don't understand how a disease that mainly affects homosexual men everywhere else in the world has spread rapidly and generally in
So
Africa.
what's your
We need to
theory then?
understand why. Well, my theory is that three things actually, as I've discovered. One is the specificity of the test. In other words, I think a lot of things in Africa will cause an HIV positive test. And I've seen that time and time again, even just how in Ireland, even with very good testing, just how wildly different the estimates are. For example, within Mountjoy Prison, we've seen wildly different estimates, coming out from medical testing. The second one is this Bangui definition which doesn't need an HIV test. In other words, you look at somebody with TB and you say, oh, he's got
Mm,
AIDS. How do
it's a
you know he
proxy.
caught it through his
Right.
penis? How do you know
Mm.
this? And yet people say, oh, I've seen it. No, you can't see it unless you do a test. And the third reason took me longest to cop onto, and I only copped onto it in the last 10 years or so. The reason that the AIDS figures are so high in Africa is because those figures are invented. And that was the most shocking one for me to realize. And I saw it there it was about 10 years back, 12 years back. UNICEF Ireland had this campaign, and you had Liam Neeson and Ryan Tubridy, who was a well known television presenter in Ireland. And they would look into the camera and they would say, every 6 seconds, a child in Africa is orphaned by AIDS. Give your money to UNICEF. So I wrote to UNICEF Ireland and said, can you give me a reference, please, for that? And the boss then, Melanie Vaved, she wrote back to me and she says, I knew her slightly as well, but she writes to me, this is very well established science. You're always told that. So I said, a few days later, I wrote back in, look, I've been searching for your very well established science. Can you please give me a reference? Where was it? Where are you getting this from? So then they wrote back saying, well, we know that 5 million children are orphaned every year in Africa. Therefore, divide 5 million
And you
by the
say,
number
right,
of
I know the
seconds in the
pitch.
year.
I know the
Yeah.
donation pitch, but tell me
Yeah.
the
Therefore, every 6 seconds, a child is orphaned by AIDS. Great. Okay. Well, so can you tell me where you got the 5 million from? And then they wrote back again saying, we will explain to you again. But if you like, we can arrange you to speak at some future date to an expert on this. And I wrote back and said, well, I'm not asking that. I'm just simply asking for your current, whatever. Oh, so you refuse to meet with us. Therefore, we are no longer talking to you. No, they did pull the advert, you know? So that bit of racism on our telly, night after night, telling us that Africans were enormously infected with sexually transmitted illnesses, they make it up. They made it up. They invented it.
I can imagine that easily. I actually know a guy who worked for fundraising for UNICEF, and his whole job was trying to figure out how to get the most money. He's very cynical about it. So, interesting
Yeah.
conversation about raising money for that particular campaign. But I thought the reason why, I haven't thought about it as much as I've thought about the trans related stuff, but I thought the reason why so many women in Southern Africa, in Africa, East Africa as well, as far as I know, are diagnosed, let's choose my words carefully, claim to have AIDS or be infected
HIV,
with
yeah,
HIV,
yeah.
was because of down low gay sex.
What does that mean? Sorry?
So you can't be gay in Senegal or Sudan or wherever,
Right.
and everyone has to get married.
So you're saying, is it that these are actually men who are saying that they're women, is it? That would explain a lot
No,
if that's it. No? Okay. Right.
I'm saying that I always assumed it was because you can't be gay, but you have to get married to a woman and have kids because that's just the expectation. But so men are having sex with men and passing it on.
That would explain a lot, yes. And it would actually explain them.
I'd be quite open to the explanation that the numbers are inflated, so
This hadn't occurred to me before. Just like in Ireland, if you look at it year after year after year, take the Irish figures, okay, and there's about 110, I think, and about 60 of them are gay men, about 10 injecting drug users, and about 30 or so heterosexuals. You will find time and time again, men outnumber the women among heterosexuals about 2 to 1, and that's been consistent for 30 years. Again, I'm the only journalist in Ireland who ever gets a breakdown on these figures. And I've asked them, I said, like, why is it that women are transmitting HIV to men in Ireland so much more effectively than men are transmitting it to women? Is there something about the Irish vagina that is particularly lethal or deadly or whatever? And of course, you can't get an answer on that. The only answer I ever got was on Jerry Ryan's show on air. A doctor said, well, that's because men go to prostitutes more. But if that's the case, you would expect all STIs to be more common,
yeah,
in men
yeah,
than in women. And I think the more plausible explanation is that gay men often pretend to be straight men, and they
yeah.
record themselves. That's a much more easy explanation to come up with.
This
And
is it.
so that hadn't occurred to me that might also be a factor in Africa because gay sex is taboo more so than here. That would be help to explain it. Yes, that would help to explain it to me
So
now.
one of the reasons why so much effort was put in by US AIDS, State Department, and UN AIDS, and all of them
Mhm.
to decriminalize gay sex is not because they care about gay people. It's because gay men are given AIDS to their wives, and their wives are
Right.
given AIDS to their children, HIV to their
Right.
children. This is my
Okay.
assumption. The other thing is, and this straight back to your point, is what I was trying to hint at yesterday was The behavior of a gay man, the sexual behavior, this is all very taboo. It's great to be able to talk about it openly. The sexual behavior and the lifestyle behavior of a man who's gay is very, very different to a man who is gay who pretends to be a woman. So, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a lad who's just a gay lad, and then we're talking about a lad who's way too feminine, can't mask up and pretend to be not gay and get away with it in Uzbekistan, in Senegal, and in Indonesia, whatever. And cultures have often created this third thing, this third gender. And it's like the discovery of fire. It happened independently in cultures all over the world. So you've got in India, they're well known hijras, and in Indonesia, they're waria. In Mexico, they're musha. In Hawaii, they're mahu. In Philippines, they're bakla. Like you've got all these things and a thousand more. And so every culture has seems to have found a workaround. These men, I would call it a homophobic carve out for a work for their existence. When you live in a very patriarchal, very heterosexual, male dominated, strict gender segregation, enforced by the women, obviously, as well. When you live in that kind of society and you've got a very twinkly young gay boy, everyone can see immediately that boy's going to grow up to be gay. That can't be allowed. Now, some gay men are able to pretend not to be gay and get away with it, but again, causes health risks for the women in their lives. These gay men who are too gay, to put it that way, too feminine, they'll often be allowed to live out this third cultural role called what we call as third gender. Now, what they do and what they get up to and how they live is very, very different to your average gay man
Yeah.
who doesn't go into that,
Yeah.
right? So, what
Yeah.
happened with UNAIDS research was that they were all being called MSM, men who have sex with men, and there was no differentiation being made. Sure, why would there? They're all just gay men. Some of them, a perfect example of this, if you need a picture in your head, is Marsha P. Johnson, who was always taken to be the ye old trans woman upon which the whole trans movement was based. Not at all. Marsha P. Johnson was a gay man who sometimes dressed up as a woman and sold sex to straight men. So what you have is those men had to be differentiated from gay men because they are much more stigmatized for real, much more marginalized, much more hated, much more rejected from society. They do not care, but, and this is the reality, they make a lot of money selling sex. So you can sell your body as let's just say trans women to use the lingo. Now, not talking about autogynephiles like Mary Lou McDonald's brother. We're talking about gay men like Marsha P. Johnson, or in our who does everyone know? Monroe Bergdorf. Bergdorf would be an example in the UK or whatever. These type of trans women were heavily targeted starting from the late 2000s because it was realized that they are much more likely to have HIV. And the stats on those men are absolutely shocking. Up to 40% of ladyboys types in Southeast Asia are HIV positive. 49% more likely to have HIV than other people. So you've got this population of men who are being called men who have sex with men forever since the AIDS epidemic started. And note that they used to be called gay men, but there was no point calling them gay men because not all these men who have sex with men are gay. So
So
this
they'd say, but go
MSM,
on. Yeah. Yeah.
so they say. Or also in really strict societies like Saudi Arabia, where men and women are segregated, boys will have sex, like teenage boys are having sex with each other and they're not gay. It's because they're completely that's the situation they're in. So I don't consider those situations to be reflective of what I understand as gay. They're men having sex with men, but they're not doing it because they're attracted to men. They're doing it because they won't meet a woman until their wedding night, you know.
Right. Okay. All right.
So MSM was the way to describe this group. Trans women was the way to describe the men who sell, because they are, and this is really genuinely true, the most marginalized people in society. Now, I'm not talking about your Jenny Maguires in Dublin, TCD or whatever. I'm talking about a rejected, homeless gay boy in Kazakhstan who is going to Russia to sell sex and coming back and feeding and is providing for his whole family for it. So what those men want is they want estrogen, they want boob jobs, and they want to be able to they need to be integrated better in society than they currently are. So what was necessary for the AIDS funders was to really differentiate those men. Now, this is my point. Sorry, I'm taking ages to say this, but here's my point. Who do you think those men are selling sex to.
When I read what you had to say yesterday, immediately this jumped out to me. They are not straight men that they're selling sex to. They're
Right.
men who say that they're straight men. And this is
Right.
their great fantasy. I hadn't realized until what you were writing, all these various cultures, this is what they do. They call them another sex. I had to say this to Barbie Kardashian because I wouldn't normally talk about my own sexuality, like, but when I met him as he came out of Limerick prison last October, and he'd just been released after 5.5 years, and he came out and he confirmed everything about all the sexual abuse he'd been shouting at the women and so on. But his great fantasy is, oh, I'm going to have sex with men, and because I'm a woman. And I think a lot of guys, not all of them, a lot of transgendered guys are actually gay guys. Not all of them, but he's a gay. I believe him to be a gay man. And his great fantasy is
He's
he
a
wants
gay
to have,
man. Yeah.
I believe he
Yeah.
is, yeah. He
Yeah.
wants to have sex with men. That's what he
Yeah.
was. No, the objects of his sexual predation is women, but that is time and again as horrible sexualized threats or violence, But and I had to say to him, look, Barbie, if you do get your bottom surgery and his boobs are growing because of the hormones, I'm not going to want to have sex with you.
Mhm.
And the doctors are telling these guys a terrible lie that they
But
can be
Paddy,
women. They
wait,
can't be women.
you won't want to have sex with him because he's not a woman because you're a man and he's a man and you're not
Yeah,
gay. But
yeah,
there are men who have a fetish for she-males
yeah,
who, for all intents and purposes, and I get a lot of shit for this, and I have a feeling you're gonna
yeah.
not like it either. This is a fetish. It's
Yeah, it
not a
is, yeah.
sexual orientation. It's
Okay,
a
yeah, yeah.
fetish. So imagine the men who are paying $200 a day to have sex with a homeless 19-year-old Central Asian drug addicted man in a dress. They are sometimes they're gay men, but often they're men with a fetish, and often they're men who live in cultures where you cannot touch women because God said no, but they're having sex with these men. So, and that is, and this is the hugely controversial part of it, that is what the Gates Foundation realized. That's what the Global Fund realized. That's what UNAIDS realized, what they all realized. And they said, this is the bridge population to the straight
Okay,
population.
yeah. But if
We
they
need
did
to do
say
something.
okay, if they did say that, they were mistaken, I think, because I used to think there was a bridge population. I used to see it for 30 years ago, all the drug addicted women prostituting themselves. I thought, oh, golly, a lot of those are HIV positive. Blokes are gonna bring that home and give it to their wives. It should have happened, but it didn't
And it
happen.
didn't.
You know,
Mhm.
the few cases of so-called documented transmission of HIV in Ireland among heterosexuals, when you look into it time and again, they're hoax stories. And they tend to be highly celebrated. That I remember this time 25 years ago, the late Linda Reid, she was there, front page of the Irish Examiner. For those of you who think that only gay men and drug addicts get HIV, I'm here to show that AIDS can happen to anyone. Her obit a few years later, her time in prison in Germany for her drug dealing and everything else. I mean, the woman was a long-standing injecting drug user, but because she was a middle-class Dublin background, she and journalists were prepared to go along with. If you look at the front page of the Irish Examiner, World AIDS Day, December the 1st, 2000, there she is, the girl next door who got AIDS, and they were quite willing to put
Well,
this up there.
do you wanna hear the most glaring example of that,
Yeah,
actually? The most obnoxious example of that, which is
yeah.
trying to pretend it's equally distributed among the population, was when back in the '90s, George Bush was under pressure to do something about the virus, the disease, the epidemic, and he started the PEPFAR fund, which is the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, I think, which is the big one in Africa, which Donald Trump was supposed to shut down and then he revved back up again. But George Bush inaugurated the Ryan, what was it, Ryan Carr? Whatever it was called. It was a little boy who got a blood transfusion. That was what became the name, the signature name, and they only did it because it wasn't a gay man, because they needed, it's almost like the opposite of like, it was like a marketing thing. It was like, if we want to take people take this seriously, not call it gay disease. So they named it after this poor little boy who got a blood
Yes, that's right.
transfusion.
Right, was it or something? I can't remember his name. Yeah.
Ryan
Um,
White?
Ryan White, Ryan White. I think that was it. Yeah, I think that was his
I said
name.
Alan
But
Ryan.
yeah.
Sorry, Alan Ryan, whoever you are.
No, you're right that from the very start, there was this pressure
Mm.
on to de-gay the image of AIDS. And when
Mhm.
that clearly wasn't happening, you had to go to Africa and suddenly declare almost every disease in Africa was suddenly AIDS. And therefore, it was thrown back at me saying, and people like me saying, how do you explain Africa? I said, I'm sorry, I can't explain Africa. When I was working in Ethiopia, 1989, 1990, and we had illnesses like cryptococcal meningitis and so on, all of which have been declared age defining now. Nobody ever said that this is
Explain to
because you.
people what you mean by AIDS defining.
All right, in what happens is obviously AIDS, HIV attacks the immune system. Therefore, at what point do you declare somebody has got AIDS? And that's a matter of definition. At what point is have they got enough opportunistic infections? And the Bangui definition came out about 1990, I think it was, as a shorthand of saying what we will call AIDS. Okay. And if you had to have one major feature, one minor. So the main one in Africa would have been tuberculosis, and then if you had diarrhea, you had whatever. Most African countries seem to have 27 listed AIDS defining illnesses. In Ireland, the HSE, the last time I checked with them, it was 31.
And
And
you're not talking about the presence of the virus HIV in the blood. You're
well,
talking
this is the
about the
difference.
illnesses, right?
In Africa, under the Bangui definition, you don't need HIV to be diagnosed. In
You
Ireland, you
just need
do.
an AIDS-defining
You just
illness.
Yeah, you just need an age-defining illness. It's almost the opposite. In Ireland, we have 31 listed age-defining illnesses and all sorts of things. For example, I noticed, in Ireland, cervical cancer is now an age-defining illness. So if you're HIV positive and you get cervical cancer, that's now AIDS, and that's helped to boost the number of women with AIDS. I noticed when Freddie Mercury's boyfriend, an Irishman, died a few years back, he died of lung cancer. And the papers made a big thing of it saying, oh, but it wasn't AIDS, it was lung cancer. Yeah, well, that's because lung cancer hasn't been declared an AIDS defining illness. If it had been declared an AIDS defining illness, they could have called it AIDS. I mean, they play with these words the whole time, that how these things are going.
Are you saying then that, let me just get this straight. So I understand, I think, the gist of what you're saying, but in terms of the numbers in Ireland, for example, when we get the numbers released every year, and I know this terminology, I think it's diagnosed abroad or
Yeah,
diagnosed
existing
previously diagnosed
diagnoses and
existing
new
diagnosis.
diagnoses is how they disguise the
Yes.
difference. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
They're HIV figures rather than AIDS figures. Yeah.
Okay, right. So that's what I just wanted to make sure. Are you saying that people in Ireland, we do tests to see who has HIV, and in Ireland, then we have another way of categorizing who has AIDS, and it's just as bad as the African system. So you can have an AIDS defining illness and be HIV positive,
You'd
or you
have
can
to
have
be
an AIDS
HIV
defining
positive
illness.
in Ireland for it to be called AIDS. You'd have to be HIV
Right,
positive. Yeah, that would be
right.
the difference. But you look at the
And
31. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
is this because, right, so I was saying to you, oh, but there could be such high numbers of AIDS in Africa because of this down low gay stuff. But you're saying that what you think these inflated numbers are actually other diseases and they're being counted as AIDS. And maybe back in the day, even 10 years ago, even now, it's difficult to get proper testing done. Is that the reason why we're using these proxy diseases? Or what would you say? That do you think it's a funding thing? Or let's go all out and say, what's your most conspiratorial idea about this? Like, put it all out there,
Well,
Paddy.
the most conspiratorial idea is they will always try to boost the figures wherever you go. That to any lobby group, any group is always going to try to boost the figures. And so you set up AIDS researchers in Africa, they're always going to find AIDS. And they're always going to see we need more funding from whatever. And I thought Vance and Trump were going to cut the funding for these AIDS groups. And I thought then we might see the truth. If it would it really cause a huge increase in the number of people dying all of a sudden? If it did, then I'd say, well, I must have got that wrong then. But as it happened, you're saying to me that's been reversed now, has it? The funding for all those HIV things, they are still going ahead with them now.
Yeah, it's back on.
It's back on. Okay, well, I was asked when Thabo Mbeki made his Patrick Pearse speech, say back in May of 2000. I wrote to him then, as the world condemned him as an AIDS denialist, and I said, I can only speak for Ireland, but I'm telling you, in Ireland, you're right, that In Ireland, it is a disease concentrated in risk groups, concentrated among gay men. Contrary to what our medical profession was saying, it's not spreading to the general population. It's not spreading to the general Irish population at all. And that's just facts from their own figures. Now, by 2012, if you look at the UN AIDS report for 2012, it's really quite startling that the only publication in Ireland that picked up on it was one called Alive, which was published in Tala
Catholic.
in Dublin. It's a Catholic newspaper. And my mum, who was a mass goer, like, my dad was your typical Irish Catholic, or not really a Masco, but my mum was an English Protestant who became a Catholic, and she was much more of an assiduous Masco. But my mum saw this and knew it would interest me and sent it to me. Now, as it was, I'd already read it because I was probably about the only journalist in Ireland who does read UNAIDS annual reports, and I'd already seen it. And it jumped out at me, saying,
Yeah.
wow, whatever happened to the we are all equally at risk, that age doesn't discriminate? If you look at the 2012 for every country, including Western Europe and North America, it says it is concentrated among drug addicts, homosexual men, prostitutes and their partners, it said, which to me it had no reason to say that. I don't believe that. Only insofar as the women in prostitution were also drug addicts, but that was UNH. But there was a complete rollback from what we've been told the previous 20 years. It was like 12 years on them saying, actually, Thabo Mbeki was right about this. Exactly what Mbeki had said about Africa was now being endorsed by UNAIDS. And that they concentrate now. All it was meant to be tearing through Russia, through India, China, a few years earlier, all of that's gone. The whole, and so you just have this whole thing of Africa is the only place that they've got their disease now. So, okay, I haven't been back to Africa because an RT used to pay me to go to Africa. That was okay. But once I took a questioning position on AIDS, that was the end of it, you
Mm.
know. And the only journalists who get to Africa are ones who come back and say, we're doing wonderful work saving these Africans through self-destructing through sex. They wouldn't let a questioning journalist go there.
A last anecdote, and then I know you have to go, but during COVID, I was trying to be a normal, regular journalist who doesn't write about controversial topics. And so I was looking for somebody who could talk to me on the topic of how diseases spread, how viruses spread, because I was thinking the story that I wanted to pitch to newspapers was people are going to understand a lot better epidemiology after coronavirus, because it was during the lockdown and people were washing their hands and they were realizing that, oh, being cold won't change anything, putting a scarf on doesn't stop how diseases spread, whatever. It was all this, although it might have a little bit of an influence in terms of how dry your mucosa is, whatever, for attach viruses being able to attach, whatever. My pitch to the story was, I wonder if this is going to teach people more about how viruses spread. And the person I found to answer my question was the guy who discovered the Ebola virus. And his name is Peter Piot, maybe you
Yes,
know
I
his
know him. Yeah,
name.
yeah, I know. I know who he
And
is.
he's
Yes, yeah.
he is, and he's Belgian, and
Hmm.
he discovered Ebola, and he's much celebrated for this. People afterwards say, well, it was him and his team discovered Ebola, and it was a very much a global effort, whatever. But he became famous as the name of Ebola. Belgium has a very robust tropical medicine institute in the Congo because of historical reasons. So Belgium has got this strong connection to disease epidemiology, blah, blah, blah. Peter Pioch, turns out, lives in Brussels, not far from me. So I got on the phone to him. We had some great chats. He talked about how back in the day, people used to think diseases were spread this way, that way, blah, blah, blah. Then his wife, who was working for the UN, had just written a book about vaccine hesitancy and she wanted to talk to me. So we had a great chat about that. She sent me a signed copy of her book. All this very good. I was writing about something clean, above board, all very well. Him and his wife, nice exchanges, all that stuff. Free gifts, even. Then I started writing about all this stuff, and I got back in touch, and I was like, "Dear Peter, I don't know if you remember me, but we had a few exchanges and a couple of calls over COVID stuff. Now I'm on to a different topic, and this time the topic is the destigmatization efforts, because it looks like you were the one who led that effort. So Peter Piot was the one who announced in the early 2000s, you know what it is? It's not viruses, it's stigma." And I wanted to talk to him about the stigma thing generally, which I'm sure he didn't want to talk about because I'm sure he got a lot of backlash at the time for moving away from the safe sex message. I mean, I know he did. I saw on historical record that people were absolutely outraged. Even AIDS campaigners were outraged that it was going to undo all the hard work of safe sex messaging that they had worked on. But I said, in particular, I noticed that it was during your tenure, because he's the one who set up UNAIDS, or he was the
UNAIDS,
first.
he was, yeah. I think he was director of UNAIDS at the time. Go on,
He
yeah.
was the director of
Yeah.
UNAs, yeah, and he was the one. He did ask for the decriminalization of prostitution and all these kind of things,
Oh,
and I wrote to him and I said, "I'm trying to figure out if there's any connection between trans women's extremely high susceptibility to being HIV positive and what we see now as the trans movement," and of course, I got the cold shoulder
right,
because
yeah.
this is not something that we're supposed to talk about. Yeah, an extremely sensitive topic. I love talking about this. I could talk about it for hours, but I won't. But I think that I'm sorry I didn't actually really get the gist of the original controversy around your reporting, but now I get it more. I knew there was something controversial about what you'd been saying. I think
I was
writing about
doing
HIV,
my
you were doing
job
a
as a
job.
journalist, and
Yeah.
let the doctors decide afterwards. But as a matter of fact, it wasn't spreading, and the doctors were time and again
Yeah.
massaging the fact, willfully misleading people. And then when Mbeke asked exactly the question I'd been asking, he got condemned for asking exactly that question. Why is Africa so different? And the doctor said, Africa isn't different. It's happening in Ireland too. I said, no, it isn't. And then, as I say, by 2012, UNAIDS said, yes, Africa is different. So now we're asking, why is Africa different? I've come up with three possible answers: is the specificity of the test, the all-embracing nature of the Bangui definition, and the fact that they make up the statistics time and again. You've heard this thing of, yeah, 40, you might have heard the one many, many times, 14,000 infections a day in Africa through HIV. I remember Bertie Ahern, who was the Taoiseach Prime Minister in relation to that. Where did they get that from? Somebody once said there's 5 million infections a year. Divide that by 365 and you come up with 14,000. And that's where this pseudo precision comes from in these things. There's a good word for it. It's called a woozle. It's one of those things that everybody thinks somebody else has got a reason for. It comes from a Winnie the Pooh story, I think. That everybody thinks somebody else has got evidence of the woozle and knows there's a woozle, you know. And I've never actually read the story, but a lot of stuff on AIDS is woozles. A lot of stuff generally. You might remember, I could give you loads of woozles over the years. You know that there was how many, the 50,000 illegal Irish, undocumented Irish in the USA. I worked extensively in the USA in the 80s and 90s documenting immigration. Where do you get this figure from? Nobody knew where the figure came from. The Taoiseach used it, the Taoiseach used it. It was picked out of the air and it just takes off. And there was 50, actually, it's far less than 50,000, I believe. But one way or another, nobody ever had the evidence for it. It's a woozle. It's one of those things. And if it suits a lot of people, it takes off, you know?
And it makes sense that it would have originated from people who'd benefit from thinking that there's a great number of undocumented Irish. So with
Irish,
the
yeah.
AIDS example, because I'm just thinking very fast here in my head, I'm going through some calculations. I have to look into a bit more, but we could imagine a scenario where when USAID shut down a lot of programs in Africa, one of the stories that popped up was, they were I suppose if you wanted to continue the money flowing and keep the system propped up, you have to keep the numbers up. Is this basically what we're saying?
Not just AIDS, everything, Rosie. Any lobby group for anything is always going to give the maximum interpretation of how big the problem is. And then journalists are inclined to say, this is a big story I have here, and they will go with the maximum shocking thing. So the result is the thing gets overstated because an awful lot of people believe they have a vested interest in making the thing as bad as possible.
A last question then for you. So we have organizations, an entire system set up for many decades in Africa, counting the numbers, asking the funds, giving the services, etc., etc. I thought the whole thing was kind of legit, but I'm open to the idea that numbers are being inflated based on bad definitions and the whole system is being propped up by maybe just bad data. Okay, fine. But the layer above that is the global fight against AIDS. According to your theory, do you think that those organizations are also involved in propagating bad data to keep themselves all in jobs and funds? Or do you think that what do you think the involvement there is? Because when I look at these people's work, they seem very sincere.
Yeah, or they believe very much in what they're doing. They do. They do. And you don't stand back from it. Like, you don't question it when you're so, when you're so close to it. But if you really believe that every disease that affects an African is because he, first of all, or she caught a sexually transmitted virus, and like your living depends on you believing that. If you suddenly say, actually, and I think, as I said, happened in the 17th century with the witchcraft thing, that if your job is to find, they didn't call it HIV then, they called it the incubus. But it was the same basic idea that sex was causing everything, that you people were having sex with the devil or with the devil's demons or whatever, and women, female demons, were the incubus, and the succubus was the female demon. And if anything happened, if a person became ill, it's because of the sex that they'd had with Satan. No, and the last people on earth that were ever going to question that were the witch finders, because their whole industry was based on finding the influence of the incubus and the succubus. If your whole living depends on finding HIV and blaming sex on everything that happens, you're going to find it. And the only way it was defeated in the end is when the governments of Europe, the kings of Europe, stopped financing witchcraft finding. If you keep financing witch finders, you will find witches. And so I'm hoping, I think in years to come, it'll be gone. We know in Ireland, no, they don't even try anymore to lie to us. They just sort of say, they do a bit by conflating immigration figures with Irish figures. But I don't know, at the highest level, it's just people are locked into it. If you keep on doing it for long enough and your whole living
It's
depends on
baked
it,
in.
it's baked in. And it's very hard to say, do you know, I could have been wrong about this all along.
Mm. Okay. On that note, this is a lovely conversation. It's so taboo. Like, even if our theories are completely wildly off the mark, or even if they're very controversial, it's just really nice to have this kind of conversation. So thank you so much, Paddy. I took more of your time than I expected.
You're welcome, Roisin. That's all right. I haven't had anybody listen to me for so long.
Come here.
It's okay, yeah.
Um, where can people find you?
My podcast, paddyspodcast.ie. I'll get the latest one up probably by tonight or by tomorrow anyway. I have a lot to listen to with the people I've met at the Homeless Persons
Right.
Unit. It's an audio podcast. It's on Spotify, it's on Apple, yeah. I've done a lot on the transgender, though. I've been speaking over the years, too, in the last, I've been doing this for 4 years now. The women who've been subjected to the presence of transgender men in prisons and in homeless hostels, and I have documented those stories, which
Yeah.
obviously is the kind of thing journalists need to be doing. So
Yes, and just for our listeners who don't know, Paddy has been an absolute champ for women. So,
thank you very
a
much,
personal
Shane.
big thank you, Paddy. Have a lovely rest of your day. Oh.
To me, it's a big champ for being a journalist, and you have a story going. You blurt it out, you put it out there. That's what the ultimate thing is, and they will never stop us. That's what the real fear of the hate speech is, isn't it? That they're going to
Yeah,
actually try to make us either not mention it, or
yeah.
worse, that's not, which most journalists go along with that, but they actually want us to pretend,
We're,
oh yes, that was a woman piece of a woman. That was,
yeah,
they're women who are being put in. Female sex offenders are doing all these things now. No, it's not going to
fair
happen,
play to you.
Roisin.
And I think stand at a place is just like probably the best advice I've ever heard for
Yeah,
just
for
go to a place and
journalism.
stand there and talk to people. This is
Talk to
your
people.
model of finding out the truth and then just tell people about it. This is very wonderful, very low-fi, very low tech.
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know. Or
Um,
I never knew that. Or I saw a quote from somebody, a Swedish writer, saying, there's a place in the forest you can only get to when you get lost. That's in other words, if you don't know what you're looking for, you have to first of all get lost, and have an open mind and just see what's there.
yeah,
I've always found that wonderfully
very good.
exciting.
It's wonderful to talk to you.
Oh, Shane, great talking to you.
Have a lovely day. Enjoy spending time with your grandkids.
Okay.
Ciao.
Ciao. Bye-bye, Roshin.
If you like my work, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to peaked.substack.com and taking out a paid subscription.